Most folks think they know the exact moment their life falls apart, but for me, it was just the quiet chime of a text message at 6:32 p.m. on a Friday. It was March 15th, 2024, our 10-year anniversary, and while I was stuck at the shop finishing up a job, a message popped up from my wife, Paige. She said she was buried under a massive deadline and couldn't make it, ending the note with "Happy 10th Anniversary" and a string of heart and kissy face emojis. It was the kind of digital shorthand you'd expect from a loving spouse, but in reality, it was the work of a woman who had been lying to my face for 14 months and had become so comfortable with the deception she could decorate her betrayals with little cartoon hearts. I was sitting in the cab of my truck parked right outside Bastions on East Carey Street down in Richmond's Shockoe Bottom. I was wearing a charcoal suit I'd picked up a few days prior specifically for this night. Now, I didn't get it at some high-end department store. I found it at a consignment shop over on Broad Street. See, master electricians like me don't exactly have a Nordstrom budget, but I figured a man's 10th wedding anniversary only happens once, and I wanted to look like I understood the weight of that. On the passenger seat next to me was a bouquet of stargazer lilies, Paige's favorite. They were the same flowers she'd held when we walked down the aisle, and I'd made sure she had a fresh bunch delivered to her office every March 15th for a decade. This year, though, I wanted to hand them to her myself across a candlelit table, just to see if she still looked at me the same way she did back when she was 29 and I was 32, standing in a church in Church Hill promising her forever. When I read that text about her being stuck at work, I almost just turned the key and headed home. I even thought about calling my buddy Tyler to see if he wanted to grab a beer and just let another night vanish into the routine of a husband whose wife was always too busy or just out of reach. But I'd already dropped an $80 non-refundable deposit for the reservation, and when you're running a small electrical contracting business, $80 is real money. I figured I'd just go in, have a decent meal by myself, drink something expensive, and toast to 10 years of marriage in silence. That one choice, the decision to walk through those doors instead of driving away, is the only reason I'm sitting here telling you this story today. I walked into Bastions around 8:10 p.m., and the hostess led me to a small table near the back. It tucked me right next to a window overlooking the alley, which wasn't exactly the height of romance, but it felt right for a guy eating alone on his anniversary. I ordered a glass of Barolo, set the lilies on the empty chair across from me, and picked up the menu. But then I looked up, and my heart just about stopped. Across the dining room, partially hidden behind a decorative wooden screen that carved out a little private nook, I saw a black dress. It wasn't just any dress, it was the one I'd bought Paige for Christmas from a boutique in Carytown. I remember her twirling in the bedroom when she tried it on, telling me she was saving it for something truly special. Well, she was wearing it tonight at Bastions. On the anniversary, she was supposedly too busy to celebrate with me. She wasn't alone either. She was sitting across from a man with silver hair and a tan that looked like it cost more than my monthly truck payment. He was dressed in a tailored suit that screamed old money, leaning in close with his hand resting right on top of hers on the white tablecloth. They had a bottle of champagne between them with those thin-stemmed glasses you only see in places where people spend cash like it's water. He said something that made her laugh, not a polite social chuckle, but that real, unguarded laugh I used to hear across our kitchen. Then she leaned across the table and kissed him. It wasn't some quick peck. It was a long, heavy kiss that had history and a clear promise of where the night was headed. It was the kind of kiss I hadn't received from my own wife in months. I couldn't even catch my breath. All the noise in the restaurant, the clinking of silverware, the low chatter, the soft jazz, just collapsed into a single high-pitched ringing in my ears, like a wire humming right before it snaps. I gripped the edge of my table so hard my knuckles turned white, and my vision narrowed until all I could see was that black dress and that silver-haired man. I stood up, ready to march over there and flip the table. I was going to look my wife in the eye on our 10th anniversary and ask her how that deadline was treating her. I was ready to cause a scene that every person in that building would remember for the rest of their lives. I only made it 2 steps before a hand clamped down on my forearm. "Sit down," a voice said. It was low and calm, but not the kind of calm you get from being relaxed. It was the controlled, steady tone of someone who's trained themselves not to break when things get messy. I turned around to see a woman in her late 40s with dark hair pulled back tight, wearing a navy blazer and a watch that looked like it was built for function, not fashion. She had the posture of someone who'd spent years in the military or law enforcement, someone who treated their body like a tool. I told her to let go of me and that she had no idea what she was interfering with, but she didn't budge. She just looked at me with these perfectly still gray eyes and told me she knew exactly who that man was, who my wife was, and exactly what was happening at that table. She told me I needed to sit back down because the real show was just getting started. There was a certainty in her voice that stopped me cold. She wasn't guessing or making it up as she went. She knew something I didn't, and that knowledge felt solid, like a load-bearing wall. I sat back down, and she took the seat across from me, right next to Paige's wilting lilies. She introduced herself as Victoria Crane, a private investigator, and slid a business card toward me with 2 fingers. She told me she'd been hired 3 months ago by a woman named Eleanor Voss, the second ex-wife of the man my wife was currently kissing. His name was Damien Roth, the CEO of the firm where Paige worked. Vivian looked me dead in the eye and told me that the destruction of my marriage was actually just a small part of a much bigger revenge story that was about to cost that man $5 million. I just stared at her, watching the waiter bring my wife and her lover a second bottle of champagne, while a stranger told me I needed to be patient for 30 minutes so she could explain how my life had become a prop in someone else's war. Vivian leaned in close and told me to stay exactly where I was. She warned me not to approach them or let them know I was even in the building. She had a colleague outside with a long lens and another person stationed over at the Jefferson Hotel where Mercer had a standing reservation in room 412. She told me if I caused a scene now, I'd just get a lot of yelling, but if I could hold it together, I'd walk away with everything. I asked her what everything meant, and she looked me dead in the eye and said it meant evidence, leverage, and a truth about my wife that went a hell of a lot deeper than a kiss in a restaurant. She told me to order another glass of wine and just breathe while she gave me the facts. So I did. I sat there and listened to a story that made the champagne across the room taste like straight-up poison. Damien Roth was 52 years old and had built his firm back in 2006 using old Virginia family money, the kind that gets your name on a building and your portrait in a hallway. He was worth about $40 million and had been through 2 divorces already. The first one was nothing special, but the second one, to a woman named Eleanor Voss, ended because he was caught sleeping with his executive assistant, a woman named Sabrina Keller. Marguerite had a lawyer who was sharp enough to include a morality clause in the settlement. It was a contract that said if Sterling ever got involved with an employee again within 5 years, he'd owe his ex-wife a $5 million penalty. Vivian told me that while his own attorneys told him not to sign it, he was arrogant enough to think he could keep his hands to himself. He couldn't. It turns out my wife, Paige, had been his executive assistant since 2018, and according to Vivian's surveillance, their affair had been going on for 14 months. 14 months. I started doing the math on all the late nights and work emergencies, and the new clothes that started showing up in her closet that didn't fit her paycheck. I thought about how cold the bed had felt and how our conversations always seemed to lead nowhere. I'd been sleeping next to a stranger for over a year, and I'd believed every single lie she told me. But Vivian wasn't done. She pulled out a bank statement and slid it across the table. It showed a personal account in Paige's name only, and every month, like clockwork, $15,000 was being deposited into it from a shell company called Mercer Advisory, LLC. The balance was over $211,000. I looked at that number, and my hands started to rattle. It's a hell of a thing to lose your nerve when you've spent 20 years working with live wires and high-voltage panels where a steady hand is the only thing keeping you alive. Vivian explained that in Virginia, half of that hidden cash was legally mine, and hiding assets like that would absolutely destroy her credibility in a divorce or a custody battle. I looked back over at the table and saw them laughing while he refilled her glass. They looked like they had the whole world figured out, like they'd covered every base, but they hadn't planned on me or Victoria Crane. I asked her why she was telling me all this since she worked for the ex-wife, not me. She told me that her job was to build a case that triggered the morality clause, and my wife was the smoking gun. If I played along, I'd get her entire case file, the photos, the hotel records, and the financial trail, to use for my own divorce. She'd been a detective for 14 years and knew that a public scene only feels good for about 10 minutes before the regret sets in. She was offering me a quiet, calculated ending that would leave Paige watching her whole life collapse in a courtroom 6 months from now. I sat there for a long time while the jazz played on, watching my wife drink champagne with the man who paid her to betray me, and I finally told Vivian to tell me what to do. She told me to go home, kiss the kids, and act like everything was normal until I could call a lawyer in the morning. I looked at the lilies on the chair, the same ones she carried at our wedding, and realized I'd bought them for a woman who didn't even exist anymore. I've started to wonder if the woman I thought I knew ever actually existed in the first place. Maybe that girl who stood in that old church in Church Hill and promised to stay by my side forever was a different person entirely. Someone I couldn't see because when you're in love, you're the one who ties the blindfold over your own eyes just so you don't have to look at what's right in front of you. I got to my feet, tossed enough cash on the table to cover the Barolo, and picked up those stargazer lilies. Vivian watched me go and just quietly said, "Happy anniversary." There wasn't a drop of sarcasm in her voice. It was just the solemn nod of a woman who'd spent 14 years as a cop and another 10 as a P, watching people's worlds turn to ash. She knew that sometimes the only thing you can give a man is the hard, cold truth, even if that truth cuts like a razor. I walked out of Bastions at 9:07 p.m., cutting right through the main dining room and past the bar without once glancing back at that corner table. I didn't look at Paige, and I sure as hell didn't look at the man holding her hand or the expensive champagne I hadn't paid for. I climbed into my truck, set those flowers on the passenger seat, and just drove home in the dark. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was quiet. Ryland and Odette were already out cold, and the neighbor girl we hired as a sitter was just staring at her phone in the living room. I paid her, thanked her, and locked the door behind her before heading upstairs to stand in the doorway of my kid's room. Ryland is 7, and he was sprawled across his bed the way young boys are, limbs pointing in every direction like he'd been dropped from a height. His mouth was hanging open, and his baseball glove was sitting right there on the nightstand because he'd been sleeping with it ever since I coached his first game back in the fall. My daughter Odette is 4, and she was curled up tight with her stuffed rabbit, her thumb hovering right near her mouth, a habit she's been trying to break but always goes back to the second she falls asleep. I stood there for 20 minutes just watching them breathe, thinking about the woman I'd married and the man she was currently with and that $210,000 she'd been hiding from me for over a year. I didn't cry, even though I wanted to. Something harder than tears had settled in my chest, something forged in those few seconds between seeing that kiss and feeling Vivian's hand on my arm. It wasn't just rage or grief. It was a cold, structural kind of certainty. I realized right then that I was going to dismantle the life my wife had built, not with a loud scene or a fit of temper, but with the same methodical precision I use when I'm wiring a building to make sure the lights stay on. Only this time, the lights were about to go out on Paige. To understand why this hits the way it does, you have to know who she did this to. My name is Marcus Holloway, born in 1980 right here in Church Hill. It's one of the oldest spots in Richmond, the kind of neighborhood where the porches sag and the houses lean, but the people living inside them are a hell of a lot tougher than the wood and brick. My mother, Marlene, raised me and my 2 brothers all on her own. She was a postal worker for 31 years, carrying mail through the humidity of a Virginia summer and the ice of winter, never calling in sick and never letting us see how hard she was struggling. She made $38,000 a year at her peak, and she never complained once. I became an electrician because electricity has a logic to it that school never did. I liked the predictability of a circuit and the satisfaction of making something work that was broken. I got my master's license at 27, and by 2009, I'd started Sable Electric with one beat-up van and a $12,000 loan from a local credit union. The lady who approved the loan knew my mother and figured if Marlene raised me, I was good for the money. She was right. I paid it back in 18 months. By the time 2024 rolled around, I had 8 employees and a reputation for doing honest work and never overcharging for it. I wasn't wealthy, but I'd built something real. I met Natalie Cross back in 2012 at a barbecue. She was 29 then, working as an assistant at a law firm, and I was 32, fresh off a job site with a small electrical burn on my polo shirt. She told me she liked that I looked like I actually worked for a living, which was a change of pace from the lawyers she spent her days with. We dated for 2 years and got married on March 15, 2014, at St. Patrick's. It was a small, simple ceremony followed by a reception at the VFW, where my mom made the potato salad. For 8 years, our life was good. It wasn't flashy, but it was the kind of marriage where you argue about the chores and then make up before bed, focusing on the kids and the house we bought on Montrose Avenue. Paige started at Mercer Gaines Capital in 2018, and it was a big step up for her. She used to talk about Damian Roth like he was some larger-than-life character in a book, a guy who ran a massive fund and had a corner office overlooking the James River. I was genuinely happy for her, and I didn't notice at the time that the way she talked about him was slowly changing from respect to something else entirely. That distance between us started creeping in late in 2022, just a little bit at a time, the way it always does before the floor falls out from under you. She started staying at the office later and later, usually walking through the front door looking like she'd been through a war. Those little nightly check-ins, the "How was your day?" or "You won't believe what the kids did," they just started drying up. First, they got shorter, then they were gone, replaced by heavy silence that filled the house like a thick fog. I tried to convince myself it was just the stress of the job or that natural wear and tear every marriage hits after a decade. I didn't want to let it go, so I fought for us. I bought that suit, I found the lilies, and I picked Bastions because she'd mentioned it once as a romantic spot months ago. I'd tucked that away in my head like I do with everything, thinking I was being a good husband. Turns out she'd tucked it away too, just for a different date with a different man. The morning after that disaster at the restaurant, I called up Richard Calloway. He's a 53-year-old divorce attorney who used to be a JAG officer in the military, and his office is tucked into an old bank building on Main Street. It felt like the right place for it, since getting a divorce in Virginia is basically a financial audit done while you're bleeding out emotionally. I laid it all out for him: the anniversary, the text, Victoria Crane, the shell company, and the $210,000. Boone just sat there with a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since the 80s, listening to every word. When I finished, he asked me how I felt, and I told him it felt like I'd been wiring a house for 10 years, only to find out the whole thing was on the wrong circuit. He told me I was right, and explained that since Virginia is a fault-based state, the evidence we had was high grade. He said the hidden money wasn't just lying, it was a conspiracy between her and her boss to defraud me. He told me we were going for primary custody, and because she'd been living a double life for 14 months, the court wasn't going to do her any favors. He also told me I did the right thing by staying in my seat at the restaurant, saying that kind of patience is what wins cases. It didn't feel like patience to me. It felt like being electrocuted from the inside out. A week later, Vivian dropped off the evidence package. It was a hammer. There were 47 photos, hotel logs for 11 different stays in room 412, bank records, and a stack of texts between her and Sterling. It showed a clear, repeatable pattern, the same one he'd used with his last assistant. Boone filed the papers on April 3rd, and he made sure Paige was served right there in her office at Mercer Gaines, right in front of Sterling and his million-dollar view of the river. That night, she came home in tears, asking me why I was doing this. I was just sitting at the kitchen table where we'd eaten 1,000 dinners together, nothing but a glass of water in front of me. I'd built this case the way I build everything, carefully and correctly, with the wiring hidden behind the walls where it belongs. She tried to give me the same old lines about the job being demanding, but I told her to stop. I told her I was at Bastions on our anniversary. I told her I sat 2 tables away and watched her kiss that man while her lying text was still sitting on my phone. She didn't just sit down. She collapsed onto the floor like her legs had been cut out from under her. She tried to tell me it wasn't what I thought, but I just started listing the facts. 14 months. $210,000. Room 412 at the Jefferson. The photos, the receipts, the whole 9 yards. I told her I knew everything because someone was already watching Sterling and she just happened to be caught in the frame. She was sobbing for real then, the kind of crying you do when the con is finally up and you've hit the wall at 100 miles an hour. She begged me not to take the kids and promised she'd end things with Sterling that very night. She even suggested counseling, but I just looked at her across that table. I told her that she chose to wear the dress I bought her for Christmas to go out for a romantic dinner with another man on our anniversary. And there isn't a counselor in the world who can fix that. Imagine sitting across from another man on our 10th anniversary and sending me a text full of heart emojis. You hid over $210,000 from me in an account I didn't even know existed, and then expected a few sessions of counseling to make it all go away. Counseling doesn't fix a betrayal that deep, Paige. Nothing on this green earth fixes that. She didn't move from that kitchen floor for a long time, and I just walked upstairs to check on my kids, closing their doors tight so they wouldn't have to hear their mother break down. That was the last real conversation we ever had as a married couple, and the 5 months of divorce that followed were handled with the kind of methodical, relentless precision I've spent my life applying to electrical work. My lawyer, Boone, built our case like a high-voltage circuit, making sure every connection was secure and nothing was left to chance. Paige's attorney tried to argue that the hidden cash was just her personal savings, but Boone pulled the records from Sterling's shell company and the judge wasn't buying a word of it. When it came to custody, the judge noted that someone who could systematically deceive their spouse for over a year while hiding 6 figures wasn't exactly showing the kind of character the court looks for. In the end, the money was frozen and split. Paige lost primary custody, and I kept the house on Montrose to give Ryland and Odette a stable home while she was relegated to every other weekend. While my life was being rebuilt, Damian Roth was facing a reckoning of his own as Marguerite's legal team moved in to enforce that $5 million morality clause. He tried to fight it for 3 months, but the judge ruled it was airtight, and that $5 million hit was only the beginning of his problems. Once the pattern of his behavior became public knowledge in the Richmond business circles, major clients started pulling their money out of Mercer Gaines Capital, and his fund dropped $60 million in value in just half a year. He didn't go broke. Guys like that usually don't. But he went from being a respected name in this city to a man people just tolerated, which for a guy who lives and breathes status is a slow kind of death. Paige got caught in the crossfire, too, getting fired under the guise of restructuring because the CEO didn't want a constant reminder of his biggest mistake walking the halls. She left without a dime in severance or a single reference, signed an NDA on her way out, and disappeared from that world entirely. Victoria Crane sent me a final report once it was all settled, including a handwritten note saying my patience had paid off and wishing me a better next chapter. She was right about that because a year has gone by and life feels honest again. This past March 15th, I didn't set foot in Bastions or buy a single lily. Instead, I took Ryland and Odette out for pizza on Broad Street, where we ate pepperoni slices and spent a handful of quarters on the claw machine. Odette won a stuffed penguin that she named Electric because she said it looked surprised, and I guess that's as good a definition of electricity as any for a 5-year-old. Sable Electric is doing better than ever, and I even hired a young kid from the old neighborhood named Jordan, who reminds me of myself at that age, early to the job and ready to learn. My buddy Tyler still stops by on Friday nights with a 6-pack and plenty of bad advice about my non-existent dating life, but I'm just not ready to connect those wires yet. My mother, Marlene, retired from the post office last year and spends half her time at my place now, taking over the kitchen and giving Ryland baseball tips with that same quiet strength she used to carry the mail for 30 years. She told me recently that I did the right thing by not making a scene that night, reminding me that we don't give people the satisfaction of watching us fall apart in public. Now, I'm sitting in my truck driving out to a job site in Henrico County with Ryland riding shotgun because it's a teacher work day. He's 8 now, getting a real arm for baseball, and he's constantly asking me how I know which wire goes where when we're on a job. I tell him you have to read the blueprints and follow the code, but you also have to realize that reality doesn't always match the plans you were given. When that happens, you just have to rely on your experience and your judgment to make things right. It's the same lesson I'm trying to teach him about his mother, giving him the truth in doses he can handle while making sure he knows he's loved and safe. I didn't flip that table at Bastions because of him and his sister, and looking at him now with his glove in his lap, I know that every second of that silence was worth the life I've managed to save. "What if you get it wrong, Dad?" Ryland asked, his voice small against the hum of the truck. "Then the lights don't come on," I told him. "Or worse, something shorts out and you've got a real problem on your hands. So you don't get it wrong. You double-check everything." "But what if you do?" he pushed. "Then you find the mistake. You trace the circuit back to the source. You fix it, and you make damn sure it doesn't happen again." He sat quiet for a moment, turning his baseball glove over in his hands, thinking it through with that serious look he gets. "Is that what happened with you and Mom? A wrong wire?" I looked at my son, 8 years old, too young for the jagged edges of the truth, but far too smart to be fed a lie. "Something like that, buddy. But the house is rewired now, and the lights are back on." He nodded, satisfied with that, and went back to pounding his fist into the pocket of his glove. I turned onto the highway, the morning sun hitting the windshield in that warm, golden way that makes Richmond look like it was designed to be beautiful. My truck smelled like coffee, electrical tape, and the kind of quiet optimism you only get when you have real work to do and people who depend on you to do it right. A year ago, I was 2 steps away from burning my entire life to the ground. I was ready to flip a table, scream at the top of my lungs, and give Paige all the ammunition she needed to tell a judge I was the unstable one. I almost gave up my leverage for 10 minutes of hollow satisfaction, but a stranger grabbed my arm and told me to stay calm because the real show was about to start. I stayed calm. The show started. And when the dust settled, the lights went out for everyone who had been operating in the dark. But mine stayed on. They always do. Now, I want to ask you, what would you do? If you were sitting 2 tables away from your spouse on your 10th anniversary, watching them kiss someone else, would you erupt? Would you make a scene that restaurant would never forget? Or would you sit back down, listen to the stranger, and let patience do what anger never could? And here's the deeper question. Have you ever faced a betrayal that was so complete it changed the way you saw the world? Not just a mistake, but a whole architecture of deception. The hidden money, the practiced excuses, the heart emojis sent while they were sitting across from someone else. Have you lived through that? And, more importantly, how did you survive? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one of them. If this story hit you where it counts, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it, especially if they're sitting in a restaurant right now, figuratively or literally, watching something they don't want to see. Stay calm. The real show is about to start. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe so you never miss another story. I'll see you in the next one.